Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take the most volatile geopolitical developments, peel back the layers of noise, and find the historical echoes, the precise legal fine print that the headlines completely miss.
And today we are diving into a really high-stakes triangle. We're talking about the United States, China, and Japan.
A triangle balanced, I think you could say, precariously on the fate of Taiwan.
It's crucial that we focus on the specifics here because the global tension didn't escalate because of some massive troop movement or a sudden diplomatic breakdown.
No, it was much smaller than that.
It escalated because of a single, highly technical legal phrase uttered by Japan's new prime minister, Sanai Takaichi, back in November of 2025.
And that phrase, which sounds, almost arcane, instantly became a major flashpoint.
Right.
When PM Takaichi spoke, she was addressing a hypothetical, the scenario of a potential Chinese use of force against Taiwan. And the specific language she used was the phrase, survival-threatening situation.
Or in the original Japanese legal term, T-Santo-2, Sanritsu Kikijitai.
And the reaction from Beijing, it wasn't measured. It wasn't diplomatic.
Not at all. It was immediate and it was national level. We saw travel warnings issued for Chinese citizens telling them to avoid Japan.
Right, the suspension of certain Japanese fishery imports.
And critically aggressive military exercises conducted right near the Japanese and Taiwanese defense zones. China explicitly declared that Japan had crossed a fundamental diplomatic and strategic red line.
And that is the core puzzle we're here to solve.
Yeah.
Why did a seemingly technical statement about Japan's domestic legal framework, it's basically legislative jargon. Why did that cause such an explosive, aggressive reaction from China?
Because those technical words are not just jargon. They are the key to a legal loophole that serves multiple, and I would say dangerous purposes.
Okay.
They connect Japan's current domestic political agenda with some of the most sensitive historical justifications for aggression, and they establish what is potentially a self-triggering mechanism designed to drag the United States into a massive regional conflict.
The stakes couldn't be higher, particularly for you, the listener, as you consider America's long-term role in Asia. This deep dive is about understanding if Japan is using its constitutional constraints, not as a restraint, but, well, as a political battering ram.
Legally preparing to pull the U.S. into a conflict that Washington might otherwise try to avoid.
So we have to confront the central question. Is this potential war truly in America's core national interest? And we start by dissecting the granular mechanics of that survival-threatening situation.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack the legal context, because without understanding the specifics of Japan's constitutional constraints, Takaichi's rhetoric makes no sense. We all know Japan is limited by Article 9 of its post-war constitution.
That's right. Article 9 famously renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of military forces for offensive purposes. For decades, this kept Japan, highly restrictive, focusing only on individual self-defense defending Japan itself.
So, if Japan cannot legally send troops for offensive missions abroad, and it can't explicitly state, we will defend Taiwan directly because that would be seen as interventionist, how did the government find a way around that?
Well, the path was carved back in 2015 under then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The Diet passed security legislation that reinterpreted Article 9 to allow for limited collective self-defense.
And that was a massive political shift.
Huge. But the compromise required setting up extremely high legal bars to prevent, an easy use of force.
Okay, this is where the terminology becomes critical. I think the original script we saw kind of glossed over this. The 2015 legislation defined 3 security situations. We really need to detail the distinctions, especially why Takaichi chose the highest one.
Absolutely. The first category, which already existed, was focused on situations that will significantly affect Japan's peace and security. This covered things like, say, supporting logistics for U.S. forces or clearing mines. Strictly non-combat roles.
Okay. And then the second newer category introduced in 2015 was the important influence situation. The Japanese is juzi ikuchitai.
Right. And this was intended for situations that, while not a direct threat to Japan, greatly influence its security. Think of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula or in the South China Sea.
So under this situation, what could Japan do?
They could provide crucial non-combat support to allies operating abroad. But even under Juche Ichichitai, Japan could not deploy combat troops or use force to defend an ally directly.
So Takaichi couldn't use that one. The important influence situation wasn't enough to justify direct involvement in a Taiwan fight. She had to jump straight to the third most severe, category.
Precisely, and that is the survival-threatening situation, the Sonoritsu Kikijitai. This category is the legal linchpin because it is the only one that allows Japan to engage in collective self-defense and deploy combat forces to aid a close partner.
And by close partner, we primarily mean the U.S.
Primarily the U.S., yes.
And the criteria for activating this ultimate status are incredibly strict, right?
They are. There are 3, and all of them must be met at the same time. 1, a country with close ties to Japan again, the U.S. must be subjected to an armed attack.
Okay.
2, the situation must threaten Japan's own survival. The language is a clear danger of the Japanese people being fundamentally overthrown or destroyed. It's very high stakes.
And the third?
3, there must be no other appropriate means available to repel the attack and protect Japan's survival.
So Takaichi's political genius, or you could say her recklessness, was to argue that a Chinese attack on Taiwan fulfills that second criteria.
Exactly. She couldn't say, we will defend Taiwan, but she could skillfully reframe the event entirely.
She reframed it not as an external intervention, but as an act of, necessary internal preservation.
Yes. By using Sonoritsu Kikijitai, she is asserting that a conflict over Taiwan, even without a direct missile strike on Tokyo, causes such overwhelming instability. It disrupts crucial sea lanes, it risks an escalation that engulfs Okinawa, it severs economic lifelines.
But all of that functionally constitutes an existential threat to the Japanese state itself.
That's the argument. And that rhetorical move is politically huge because it bypasses the constitutional handcuffs. It transforms what would normally be
and that explains Beijing's reaction.
Completely. The Chinese leadership understood immediately that Japan wasn't just engaging in standard political rhetoric. They were activating the domestic legal path, the Sonoritsu Kikijitai, which is the functional trigger for Japan to become an active, frontline belligerent.
It signals a readiness to fight.
It signals a readiness to fight, and that changes the entire strategic calculus in the strait.
The Chinese are essentially saying, if you define an external conflict as an internal threat to your survival, you are preparing for war. And when Japanese leaders start talking about national survival to justify military action, history shows us exactly where that path leads.
And that transition is absolutely critical because this is not merely a modern legal debate. The language chosen by Takaichi, this reliance on the concept of survival to justify highly risky or, aggressive external action, is a direct, painful echo of Japanese imperial rhetoric from the decades leading up to World War II.
It's not just a casual resemblance, it's the exact ideological architecture. In the 1930s, this concept of self-preservation became the all-encompassing, unquestionable justification for expansion and aggression.
And you have to think about how this message was spread. It wasn't just in secret government memos. The military and the expansionists, they created a public narrative that Japan was this besieged, vulnerable nation, totally dependent on external resources and facing hostile powers.
The U.S., the U.K., Russia.
Right. And therefore, expansion was sold to the Japanese public as a matter of pure, almost biological necessity.
So let's look at the key historical examples where this rhetoric was used. The Manchurian incident in 1931 feels like the clearest starting point.
Absolutely. The invasion and the subsequent occupation of Manchuria, which led to the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo, was obviously aggressive expansion. It was about securing territory and resources.
But that's not how it was sold.
Not at all. How is it justified politically? Not as conquest, but as necessary action for economic and demographic survival. The Japanese empire, they argued, couldn't feed its growing population or fuel its industrial base without the iron ore and coal of Manchuria.
That reframing is key. It turns a blatant act of aggression into a moral necessity.
And the same logic was applied when the conflict escalated into the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War starting in 1937.
Right.
The rationale for a prolonged and incredibly brutal conflict across the vast territory of China was continually framed around this high-stakes existential language. They weren't fighting for land, they were fighting to secure the empire's survival.
The idea being that unless China was subdued and transformed into a stable, resource-providing partner controlled by Japan, of course, the Japanese nation would eventually wither and die.
Exactly. And the most dramatic instance of this justification comes right before the U.S. entered the war. When the U.S. imposed a comprehensive oil embargo in mid-1941, Japanese leaders had a genuine resource crisis on their hands.
A very real crisis.
They absolutely did, but the way they interpreted it sealed the path to war. They didn't view it as a diplomatic pressure point or a challenge to be negotiated. They deemed it a season, no kiki life or death threat.
The same kind of
The
language?
same kind of language. They argued they were backed into a corner and forced to strike south to seize oil reserves in Indonesia and to eliminate the U.S. naval presence that stood in their way.
And the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, the ultimate act of aggression, was thus rationalized both at home and internationally as an act of preemptive self-defense.
A measure taken for national survival.
So the profound insight here, and why China reacts so violently to PM Takaichi's Sonitsu Kikijitai, is that the current language isn't just vaguely similar.
No, it echoes the exact emotional and ideological playbook used 8 decades ago to launch catastrophic regional wars. It suggests a political philosophy where external, risky military action is viewed as the only guaranteed method for internal preservation. It is a historical tripwire the region simply cannot ignore.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though. Isn't it perhaps unfair to compare a modern democratic leader's careful legal interpretation, which is aimed at deterrence, with the imperial military's clear expansionist aims of the 1930s? Are we reading too much historical baggage into one technical phrase?
That's a fair challenge, and it really speaks to the complexity of historical analysis. I think the problem lies not just in the phrase itself, but in the context of the speaker, who we'll get to shortly, and the regional memory.
Right.
For Beijing, for Seoul, for others who bore the brunt of that imperial expansion, the legal intent of the phrase doesn't matter as much as its rhetorical utility. Once you open the door to defining foreign crises as domestic existential threats, you dramatically lower the threshold for military intervention, regardless of your initial motivation.
So the comparison is potent, because the consequence is the same.
The potential consequence is the same, the normalization of Japanese military action beyond its own borders.
To properly contextualize the sensitivity in East Asia today, especially around this U.S.-Japan alliance versus historical U.S.-China collaboration, we need to take a deliberate pause. We need to remember a deeply sacrificial moment from World War II.
A moment that completely destabilizes the simplistic narrative of permanent alliances.
We need to talk about the Doolittle raid, April 1942.
This was the first major U.S. airstrike against the Japanese home islands after Pearl Harbor. It was a massive psychological victory for the Americans.
A huge morale boost, but it was a high-risk operation. The planes were launched early from aircraft carriers. They bombed Tokyo and other targets, but they couldn't land back on the carrier.
Right, they didn't have the fuel, so many of them were forced to crash land or bail out over occupied China.
And this is where the historical complexity comes in. Who helped these American pilots who suddenly found themselves stranded behind enemy lines deep within territories controlled by the Japanese military?
It was the Chinese people. Chinese civilians and soldiers, both nationalist and communist forces, risked everything to shelter these Americans, to guide them to safety, and to treat them as partners against a common enemy.
It was an immense act of global partnership. They provided safe passage for about 64 downed American airmen. But the cost of this act of kindness, this alliance support, was horrific.
It was unparalleled. Japan's response to the Chinese people assisting American pilots became one of the most brutal, punitive campaigns of the entire war. They launched a scorched earth offensive, the Zhejiang-Jiangyi campaign, specifically to hunt down the Americans and punish anyone who helped them.
The statistics are chilling. You really have to reflect on them. While only about a dozen American pilots were directly aided in these specific areas.
Historians estimate the Japanese military killed as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians in brutal retaliation.
250,000 people.
Just think about that scale of human tragedy. 250,000 innocent lives extinguished purely because they aided a handful of U.S. servicemen. This wasn't battlefield collateral damage. It was systemic, organized punishment.
Designed to break the will of the Chinese population and deny the Americans any sanctuary.
Exactly.
This event, which few Americans know outside of, war history circles, it was briefly dramatized in that 2017 film In Harm's Way. It serves as an incredibly powerful yet forgotten historical cornerstone.
It does. It reminds us that for the Chinese, the relationship with the U.S. was forged in blood against a common Japanese aggressor, and they paid a price far, far higher than any other U.S. ally in the Pacific.
When we discuss current geopolitics, we often fall into this trap of viewing alliances as these timeless, permanent structures.
And this history reminds us that there was a deeply profound, sacrificial U.S.-China partnership that predated all the modern tensions.
It fundamentally complicates the modern narrative. When China expresses this deep sensitivity or anger about renewed Japanese military ambition, especially when it's linked to that old rhetoric of survival, they are not reacting to a modern threat in a vacuum.
No, they're looking through the lens of those 250,000 civilians who died specifically for helping the United States. That context makes the current Japanese political maneuvers feel profoundly threatening to Beijing.
Okay, so if the phrase Sonritsu Kiki Jitai is the mechanism and the historical echoes are the fuel, then we have to analyze the engineer.
Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi. Her statement is not an isolated policy position. It is the culmination of a powerful, organized, and long-term ideological project.
Who is Takaichi beyond her current title? The sources identify her as one of the most conservative, right-wing, and profoundly nationalist figures in contemporary Japanese politics.
And her ideological commitments are not subtle. They are the bedrock of her entire career,
Crucially, she is a high-profile member of Nippon Kaigi, the Japan Conference.
which is identified as Japan's largest and most influential far-right revisionist organization. To understand Takaichi's political goals, you really have to understand the organizational power of Nippon Kaigi.
So how high up in the political establishment does that ideology run? Is Nippon Kaigi just some marginal fringe group, or do they hold real power?
Oh, they hold immense power. They are far from marginal. Nippon Kaigi advocates run deep within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, and they control significant factions. Their influence isn't just moral, it's structural.
They're actively lobbying staffing positions.
Exactly. They actively lobby the Diet, and they staff key government positions. When Takaichi speaks, she is speaking as a representative of this highly mobilized, politically successful group that is dedicated to constitutional and historical change.
We see that alignment not just in her words, but in her actions. Specifically, her repeated visits to Yasukuni Shrine.
And these visits are highly political statements. Yasukuni is internationally controversial because, in addition to honoring all war dead, it enshrines 14 convicted Class A war criminals from World War II.
So for Takaichi, a visit is a signal.
It's a signal to her base and a provocative gesture to the entire region that she embraces a revisionist view of Japan's wartime past. She is essentially arguing that those actions were not criminal but were necessary sacrifices.
And this takes us to the overarching, long-term ideological goals of her faction, goals that explain why she chose the Taiwan rhetoric she did. This isn't just about Taiwan. It's about changing Japan forever.
Exactly. The ultimate prize for this group is the complete revision or outright removal of Article 9, the Peace Constitution. Her Taiwan rhetoric serves as the ideal political catalyst for this constitutional change.
Explain that connection for us. How does talking about Taiwan advance the goal of revising Article 9?
Well, if Takaichi can successfully argue to the Japanese public that Japan's survival is now dependent on its ability to project military force abroad,
That the restrictive Article 9 prevents Japan from defending its core interests.
then it creates immense political momentum. The framing of Sonritsu Kikijitai is a tactical move that argues, see, the Constitution is crippling us in the face of an existential threat. We must normalize military operations abroad, strengthen our capabilities, and ultimately get rid of Article 9 so we can defend ourselves properly.
Her statement serves that dual purpose then, preparing for a potential conflict while simultaneously driving a domestic political agenda that has been stalled for decades.
It's a political masterstroke, but one with massive geopolitical consequences.
So Takaichi has found her domestic legal path to intervention. But as we establish, Japan can't just ignore the rest of the world. If they decide to engage Chinese forces in the Taiwan Strait under this survival framework, what does international law say, regardless of what the Japanese Diet says?
And this is the source of the immense legal risk for Japan. The international framework for the use of force is extremely narrow. It's governed by the UN Charter.
Right.
And under that charter, a country generally has only 2 permissible ways to legally use military force against another sovereign power.
Let's start with the one most people understand: self-defense.
That's Article 51 of the UN Charter. It confirms the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if and only if an armed attack occurs against a UN member state.
Okay, so if China attacks Japanese territory, Article 51 applies. Japan can use force. Simple. But if China attacks Taiwan, Can Japan still legally claim Article 51 allows them to intervene?
Absolutely not. And this is the crux of the international law problem. Japan has no stand-in to claim self-defense based on an attack on Taiwan.
And why is that?
Because under prevailing international conventions, Taiwan is not recognized as Japanese territory. It is not a formal treaty ally of Japan. And most critically for the UN framework, it is not a recognized sovereign state with UN membership.
So Japan can't use force based on an attack on Taiwan. What about collective self-defense? Can they argue they're defending the U.S. if the U.S. intervenes?
They can argue it domestically using the Sunritsu Kiki Jitai framework, but internationally, that argument is extremely weak unless the U.S. itself is attacked first. If Japan initiates the fight, international law views it as Japan entering a conflict that does not directly involve its own self-defense.
Okay, so self-defense is out unless Japan is struck first. That leaves the second legal path for using force under the UN Charter.
That would be authorization from the UN Security Council. The UNSC can sanction military intervention to maintain peace and security.
But in this particular scenario, the very structure of the Security Council makes that path impossible.
Precisely. China is one of the 5 permanent members and holds veto power. Any resolution sanctioning military intervention in a Taiwan conflict, whether by the U.S. or Japan, would be instantly vetoed by Beijing.
So the legal conclusion is, well, it's terrifying for Japan. If they act under their domestic survival clause and send combat forces into the strait to engage the People's Liberation Army.
That action constitutes illegal aggression under international law.
And what's the consequence of that?
This is the critical legal vulnerability. If Japan commits illegal aggression, China is legally entitled to respond with force in self-defense against the Japanese aggressor. China could retaliate against Japanese bases, ships, or even the home islands and claim legal justification for doing so under Article 51.
So Japan would have provoked a war and lost the moral and legal high ground internationally.
Completely.
This vulnerability leads directly to the core concept of our deep dive. The entrapment risk. Japan's domestic legal move, combined with its legal vulnerability under international law, transforms the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty from a defensive shield into a potentially inescapable military trap for Washington.
The Security Treaty is the ironclad promise that defines the entire region. Let's just revisit the core non-negotiable obligation, Article V. It states that the U.S. is obligated to defend Japanese territory against armed attack.
That obligation is clear. But we have to emphasize that the U.S. is not obligated to join Japan's wars of choice. If Japan decided to launch an unprovoked attack on a third party, the U.S. is not required to jump in.
No. And Japan intervening in Taiwan does not automatically obligate Washington to enter the conflict.
That is the crucial theoretical firewall the U.S. relies on. Washington wants the ability to decide on its own terms whether to defend Taiwan, maintaining its strategic ambiguity.
But the Sunritsu Kiki Jitai framework is designed to bypass Washington's choice entirely.
Let's break down the precise mechanics of this 4-step entrapment scenario. I want to focus on the specific targets that make this risk so unavoidable.
Okay. Step 1. Japan, using its newly established domestic justification, the Sonritsu Kiki Jitai, decides the time has come to intervene. It deploys combat forces, maybe the Maritime Self-Defense Force, into the Taiwan Strait.
And as we just established, this is viewed as illegal aggression by China and under international law.
Right. So step 2. China, viewing Japan as the illegal aggressor, legally retaliates. Beijing can justify this as self-defense against Japan's infringement on stability and aggression.
Step 3 is the key. China targets specific assets. This is the moment of entrapment.
It is. China knows how the U.S.-Japan treaty works. They have several options for retaliation, all of which are designed to trigger Article V. They could target Japanese ships or bases.
Or they could target Japanese territory like Okinawa or the home islands.
Or, and this is crucial, they could target U.S. military personnel or facilities stationed on Japanese soil. The major bases in Okinawa, for example.
And this leads to step 4, the inevitable trigger. If Chinese retaliation hits U.S. troops, or if it hits Japanese territory, the U.S. has lost its choice.
The treaty obligation kicks in. The U.S. is now legally obligated to defend Japan under Article V.
And the war immediately becomes a direct U.S.-China confrontation.
Exactly. Japan, through its domestic reinterpretation and subsequent aggressive action, has effectively leveraged the alliance structure to force Washington's hand, regardless of whether the Pentagon or the White House wanted to be involved in the Taiwan conflict initially.
It's the ultimate example of burden sharing going catastrophically wrong. Instead of reducing the U.S. burden, Japan increases the risk of entrapment.
using the credibility of the U.S. defense commitment as its own legal shield.
And this is why you emphasize the historical parallels.
Yes. When Imperial Japan needed a war, they used rhetoric to justify it. Now, when modern Japanese nationalists seek to normalize military action, they use legal engineering to guarantee U.S. backing for it. The result is the same. The U.S. position in Asia is being dictated by the perceived survival needs of its ally.
Given this extreme entrapment risk, how is the current U.S. administration responding to this rhetorical and legal escalation from Tokyo? I mean, they can't possibly be ignoring the potential consequence of Takaichi's strategy.
Washington is walking a diplomatic tightrope, so finely tuned, it risks snapping.
Yeah.
They have to maintain two sort of contradictory positions at the same time.
Okay.
On one hand, they must fully support Japan as the indispensable security anchor in the region. On the other, they have to maintain strategic stability in the Taiwan Strait while upholding the long-standing U.S. posture of calculated strategic ambiguity.
Okay, let's define that term for any listener who may not be steeped in geopolitical jargon. What does strategic ambiguity mean in practice, and why is Takaichi's rhetoric actively trying to undermine it?
Strategic ambiguity means the U.S. intentionally refrains from guaranteeing military intervention if China attacks Taiwan. The policy serves two purposes. First, it deters Beijing by keeping them uncertain about the U.S. response.
That's second.
And crucially, it discourages Taipei and Tokyo from declaring independence or escalating aggressively because they know they might not have a guaranteed defense.
So Takaichi's move declaring a conflict near Taiwan an existential threat to Japan is actively trying to shred that ambiguity.
Yeah.
It forces Washington to clarify its position whether it wants to or not.
Precisely. And this is why the U.S. response is so carefully orchestrated. Washington is making sure it is not endorsing Japan's new, aggressive Sonritsu Kiki Jitai interpretation.
And why that refusal to endorse?
Because an endorsement is tantamount to giving Japan the diplomatic green light to initiate a chain of events that triggers Article V. It would effectively hand Japan the keys to U.S. military intervention.
So the U.S. strategy is one of restrained deterrence.
That's a good way to put it. Deter China by ensuring its military capabilities in the region are robust, thereby signaling that force against Taiwan is highly risky. But at the same time, they're trying to avoid encouraging Japan into escalation by offering a guaranteed defense commitment for actions that are essentially Japan's domestic political choices.
That ambiguity is now extremely fragile. Every time Takaichi or her faction uses this language, it increases the signal to Beijing that Japan is serious about intervention.
Which, in turn, increases the tension and makes an eventual entanglement more likely. Washington is trying to maintain strategic restraint in the face of an ally that is politically compelled to seek strategic commitment.
The U.S. knows that if Japan continues this rhetorical escalation, they risk creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict.
All started by a technical phrase rooted in history.
We have covered immense ground, moving from a specific Japanese legal phrase, the survival-threatening situation, to its painful echoes in pre-WWII imperial aggression, the tragic, forgotten history of Chinese sacrifice for the U.S., and the mechanics of an alliance trap waiting to spring on the United States.
And this analysis forces us to move past the headlines and engage with the central dilemmas that this entire scenario presents, especially as these tensions define the coming decade. As American citizens, you have to consider these core questions.
First, let's return to the source of the conflict. With the economic costs and geopolitical risks involved, is it truly in America's core national interest to fight China?
And further, should that choice be dictated not by Washington's assessment of Taiwan, but by Japan's domestic political determination that its own survival is threatened?
Second, we have to quantify the cost. A major conflict between the world's two largest economies would guarantee global economic devastation. What is the acceptable threshold for that destruction, and how many American lives are justifiable to defend Japan's interpretation of its own domestic security requirements?
Third, and this is a big one, let's look at the ultimate strategic outcome. If a war were to break out, both the U.S. and China would emerge severely weakened, regardless of who wins.
But what happens in Japan?
The far-right political faction, the one that used the Sonritsu Kiki Jitai framework to push the nation toward war, would likely emerge significantly more powerful, having achieved its goals of normalizing military action and revising the Constitution.
The final overarching question, then, is one of national sovereignty and self-determination.
Should the security choices of the United States, the deployment of its military, the fate of its economy, be driven by the domestic political objectives and survival claims of an allied government, or must they be driven strictly, transparently, and ruthlessly by America's own defined national interests?
The sources have provided a stark mirror, reflecting the past onto the present. And this brings us back to the powerful reflection that frames the entire historical and legal context of this moment.
History is rhyming. Before America steps into another war in Asia, the question must be asked, why now? For whose benefit? And at what cost? It is a profound life and death question that requires deep reflection, far beyond the technical definition of a single legal phrase.